So it's time for our rhyme of the week, and this week we're doing a phrase, not a rhyme. It is a fan pick. I do want to say it does get a little heavy, so a quick content note before we start. This one briefly mentions domestic violence in a historical context, so if that's not something that you're interested in, please don't watch the video. That being said, we are going to go into the phrase rule of thumb. Now, I thought rule of thumb was just a general guideline, a rule to live by. I didn't realize until I started doing the research that a lot of people actually associate it with domestic violence. So we're going to talk about that. Where did the phrase rule of thumb actually come from? Short answer, not from a law like a lot of people believe. Now, I need you to stick with me. The phrase actually appears in English as early as the 1600s, and it had nothing to do with domestic violence. It actually referred to using your thumb as a rough measuring tool. Brewers used it to test temperature, craftsmen used it for approximate measurement. It meant an informal method, not an exact rule. That's documented in early English dictionaries as well as usage records. So you're probably wondering where the domestic violence story comes from. There's a widely repeated claim that English law once allowed a man to beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb. But historians have found no statute in English law that actually states that. The phrase rule of thumb existed long before it was linked to that idea. The association appears much later in the 18th and 19th centuries, often in commentary citing abusive practices, not establishing legal permission. In 1782, Judge Francis Buller was accused in satirical cartoons of supporting such a principle, but even then, it wasn't written law. The phrase and the alleged rule became combined over time. Now, this means two things can be true. Domestic violence absolutely existed, but rule of thumb did not originate as a legal allowance for it. Unfortunately, by the late 20th century, the phrase was widely believed to have violent origins. And once a story sticks, it spreads, especially when it sounds as plausible as it did. So rule of thumb isn't dark because of what it meant. It's dark because of what people believe it meant. And while rule of thumb isn't a rhyme, it's a perfect example of how language evolves and how history gets rewritten in conversation. Sometimes the real story isn't more dramatic, it's just more complicated. So that is rule of thumb. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments, and I will see you next week for another rhyme. Okay, bye.